That's Debatable is sponsored by MB&G. MB&G is specialists in the esoteric world of vehicle and furniture warranty insurance, delivering quite marvellous customer service, prompt claims payment, and a highly developed understanding of how to deliver these products in a way that is both compliant with the regulations and attractive to customers. To find out more, call Paul Smith, the Managing Director, on 07887 501 441. That's 07887 501 441. Hello and welcome to That's Debatable, the weekly news podcast of the Free Speech Union.
Hello, everyone. Happy birthday to you, Tom, again.
That's very kind, Ben. That's very kind. It's a very strange time to be celebrating a milestone birthday because it feels like in a week the news has moved so rapidly. And any kind, I think we were talking about this, Ben, any kind of celebration at this time when we see what's going on in the news feels very incongruous. Very almost like a sort of cognitive dissonance because there's so much when you switch on the TV that's going on with the riots and with the talk of things that the government's going to do in terms of managing us online and offline. It just feels very surreal, I think it was fair to say at the moment, in certainly in the United Kingdom.
Yeah, and one of the other things we were talking about, you said, Tom, then, seeing things on TV, and I'm on Twitter and you're not. And I think that fundamentally changes how people perceive what is going on in the news, and their understanding of the narrative of events, of who the different parties in these riots and these protests are. And some of the scenes that have been unfolding on Twitter, obviously horrendous, utterly shocking. One of the things that we want to talk about, obviously our interest is in how the government's reaction to this is going to impinge upon freedom of speech. That's our professional interest at the Free Speech Union. And I don't know if we want to get into this right away, Tom, but one of the elements we want to talk about is this perennial call that comes to bring an end to online anonymity, to ban people from having anonymous social media accounts. And should we get into that now, Tom? Should we go into that topic first of all?
I think we should. I mean, just as we're on the cusp of getting into it, I was going to ask about this Twitter versus mainstream media, because you and I have very different experiences of soaking up information. One of the reasons I'm not on Twitter is that I think and a lot of people find it to be quite, you kind of get sucked into it. It's like a sort of black hole of social media where you get sucked into it. You get your blood's up before you know it. Your frustration is up. And my question to you was, do you feel, I suspect you do, but I suppose more generally, do you feel better informed through Twitter? And do you think that applies to all Twitter users, that they're all better informed through Twitter? Because obviously it's not got, I know we talk all the time about the filters that mainstream media puts on, the news they tell us, the news they don't, and that matters because it changes the final product sometimes a lot. But do you feel that Twitter does make people better informed in general?
Yeah, definitely. No question about it.
Profound.
It's the best place for breaking news, particularly since Elon Musk bought it. There's just nowhere else like it. You have the risk of incorrect information and gossip and rumor and all the rest of it, but in terms of raw video footage of what's happening in any given town in northern England over the weekend, say, it is just the best place to go to see the breaking news. I mean, I think that the flip side to that is that if you are an obsessive Twitter or social media user, which must be a very significant percentage of users in the UK. I think Twitter has about 20 million people who use it in Britain. And the percentage of that who are kind of obsessives on it, I think there is a danger that you end up making yourself very unhappy following very negative news. But we live in very difficult times in many ways. And one of the things actually was strange for me, on Saturday night, on Friday night, we were watching this new film, Civil War. I don't know if you've seen this, Tom. It's absolutely brilliant. It's about a photojournalist, two photojournalists, traveling through a war-torn United States that has gone into a civil war that's very cleverly done, because the film never quite explains how the Civil War has come about, and it treats the subject matter in a way that is not off-putting. So if you're a Trump supporter or an Antifa supporter or whatever, I think you could probably sit down and watch the film and get into it. So it's very, very cleverly done. I think mainstream Republicans and Democrats could both engage with it, and it's pretty brutal. It's pretty brutal, and so you follow this small group of characters as they travel to Washington DC to try and interview the president of the United States, who is waging a war against an alliance of California and Texas. So that's the other thing. People will quite rightly say, well, it's quite improbable that if there's a civil war in America that California and Texas are going to be on the same side. So it quite adeptly avoids explaining the conditions in which that has happened. But nonetheless, I was watching that. Obviously, scenes in Britain of police stations being set fire to, and hotels and all the rest of it. And I've also been reading about the civil war that happened in England in the 12th century between Stephen and Matilda. So it's been, all of this stuff has been stewing around in my mind, as it will have been, I expect, for every single one of our listeners and viewers. But nonetheless, we're in this position where all of this stuff is going on, and as with so many of these types of events, the government has this instinctive response. Lots of politicians have this instinctive response of, right, let's clamp down on freedom of speech.
That's really interesting about Twitter, that you're absolutely convinced it's moving at that much faster pace, and that in general is a good thing. And it does lead us, I think, onto that first topic of online anonymity, because what that means, given your answer to that question, and I guess listeners, viewers may agree or disagree, what that means is that it's an incredibly important information tool in the new information revolution we're going through. And yet we know that it's going to come under attack from authorities who are threatened by it. And I think, as I've been thinking about it over the weekend, the concern I have is knee-jerk reactions, fast reactions to clamp down on something like Twitter, on online sharing of information in a way that absolutely has the effect that the government desires. In other words, it quells the incitement, but it has all of these very chilling side effects that innocent parties partaking in freedom of speech and expression online get caught up in. But do you want to go into the anonymity topic specifically?
I do. This is a bugbear of mine. There's also a really good article written by Ben Sixsmith in the Critic that I'd recommend reading on this topic, that was published over the weekend. So I was on GB News on Monday morning, first thing on Monday morning, talking about this, debating against Tobias Ellwood, the former Conservative Member of Parliament, who's come up with this proposal that social media users should have to pay a nominal fee of £1 a year or something, so that every single account can be traced back to its real owner. So no more egg accounts, no more anonymous Twitter people hounding MPs and being abusive and all the rest of it. Now, I can see why, if you're a Member of Parliament or a Member of Parliament's staff, and you're getting abuse all day, your experience of Twitter is going to be quite different to the average user. I think that's an important disconnect to bear in mind. But this topic, this idea of making online anonymity impossible, comes back time and time and time again. We spoke about it a few episodes ago, in fact, probably a few months ago, we were talking about the murder of Sir David Amess MP back in 2021 by a jihadist. And following that, there was this bizarre campaign, completely bizarre campaign, to ban online anonymity, to clamp down on abuse of members of parliament. Now, that is completely unrelated. There is no connection whatsoever between the killer in that case and what that law, David's law, as the proposal was called in the press at the time, would have achieved. Similarly, I think with these riots, I think if you took down every single anonymous social media account, if you take them down on Friday morning, I still think broadly the same sequence of events would have unfolded over the weekend. I think, in fact, if you took down social media, broadly the same sequence of events would have unfolded at some point in the United Kingdom in the near future, because all of these problems, in my view, are fundamental issues of integration or the lack of it, mass immigration, political unresponsiveness, and all of them have been bubbling away for decades. You can go all the way back to Ted Cantle's report about the Oldham riots in 2001, years before social media had even been invented. And you can see his warning about people in Britain living parallel lives, not integrating with each other, communities living in balkanized towns. So all of this stuff, these are intractable problems that politicians constantly avoid talking about, even when one of their own is murdered, as in the case of Sir David, even when large parts of the country are subject to the sort of disorder that we have seen, and the rioting and increasingly belligerent rioting that we've seen over the course of the weekend. So partly it's an attack on freedom of speech. That's the main focus for us. But secondly, it is also a way, I think, of politicians trying to turn the national conversation to something that's easier, that's more palatable, and that avoids having some very difficult conversations about integration, mass immigration, political responsiveness.
There's a parallel here, as you were talking, of another form of surveillance, shall we say? So there's not communication, but actual state surveillance, which I always think of as the CCTV reality. You know, you probably don't remember a time when there was not closed circuit television watching everything that we do. Well, there genuinely used to be a time when you would be reliant upon other citizens to be witnesses, and there was no TV footage, and now it crept in initially, and there was a lot of kickback against it to say this is clamping down on our freedom and our right not to be observed as we go about our business. And what's now happened is it's not just that it's become ubiquitous, i.e. CCTV is absolutely everywhere. In London, I must be filmed maybe 10, 15, 20 times before I even get to the local corner shop. But what happens is then that it's actually being boasted about. So now, you take Transport for London or a shopping centre in London, there'll be signs out saying, "Smile, you're on TV."
Yeah.
And so it's not so the narrative around state observation of the citizenry has changed from, "Oh, don't worry, this is only going to be used in exceptional circumstances," to creeping to be ubiquitous, to creeping to being ubiquitous, and we're proud of it. Yeah. And I feel that that's a parallel to what you're saying in terms of anonymity. That if it's a thin end of the wedge argument, obviously, yeah. But it's quickly forgotten how important anonymity is to certainly certain groups require anonymity.
Yeah.
And I think you talked about that on GB News. So Exmuslims, for example, clearly it can be the only lifeline for those who are living in that environment.
Can I?
You pick up on that.
I'm chomping at the bit to talk about that issue because
when
you do these live TV things, you get 2 or 3 minutes maximum, and this morning I only got 1 minute, and there's so much to say on this topic, and I gave the example.
Yeah. So if I could just interrupt you there, then
so I gave this example of Exmuslims, a group of people who I studied for my PhD over the last beginning 5 years ago. There was one particular case that really stayed in my mind. I spoke to a lot of people who had quite similar situations, but one particular case of a young woman. She was 19 when she spoke to me for this research interview about her experiences. She grew up in an ultra-conservative household in a Muslim majority area. Now, I was talking about Oldham and parallel lives. Can I just give one statistic from a report done 8 years ago by Dame Louise Casey on integration? And she went to a school in a Muslim majority area and asked students to guess what percentage of Britain's population was Asian. And the students guessed that it was somewhere from 50 to 90%, because that was their experience in their local area and their experience in their childhood, which they then extrapolated across the entire country. So bear in mind how monocultural some of these areas actually are. So if you're 19 years old and you're a lesbian, as this young woman was, you're living in an area like that, you have absolutely nobody you can speak to. I spoke to another woman, this is a separate ex-Muslim, who said to me that approaching people in real life to try and talk about the fact that you don't really believe in Islam and that you're pretending. She said it was like the predicament of Winston in 1984, where you can look at people's reactions and you can think perhaps that person they seem a little bit hesitant. Or they said this odd comment to me once. Maybe they don't believe either. And you go through this whole process of trying to identify other people in the outer party who it might be safe to approach. But the second you get that wrong, you're done for. So in person, in that sort of circumstance, it's completely impossible. And so to go back to the 19-year-old I was talking about, she was living, she'd grown up under pretty horrendous conditions of parental abuse, including, importantly, financial control. She had this secret relationship. She had a secret phone. She had an anonymous social media account. Now, those things were her only lifelines to the outside world, to the rest of the country, to the rest of the world, beyond this stifling environment of ultra-conservative Islam. This is all happening in Britain. I just want to repeat that again. This is all happening in Britain. Now, I put this point to Tobias Elwood earlier, and I said, everything you're proposing is going to make that young woman's life more wretched and more difficult. And by the way, it's also not going to do anything to stop the riots. And all that proposal will do, in fact, is silence people like that ex-Muslim young woman. And he said, well, no, you can go to the NHS, you can get help from the state. And I unfortunately didn't then get a chance to respond to that, because in this case, the young woman, she did flee home. She went to a women's refuge before going to start university. There was quite a dramatic scene where she escaped from the family home. Eventually, as I say, she reached this women's refuge, and she was speaking to a police officer about what had happened and about her life and about her story. And she said, I'm scared that if I talk about this, that people will attack me or that I'll be put in danger. And the response of the British state to that was, well, perhaps it's better not to talk about it. So the idea that you can just tell the NHS, or you can tell
it's for the birds.
It's nonsense. It's complete nonsense.
And I've heard you speak. I think I've heard you speak about this case or a similar case before, and you also said that the police officers or the authorities were unable really to understand the distinction between being an ex-Muslim, being an ex-Muslim and a lesbian or a gay person. All the different groups that we're supposed to be terribly familiar with and good with. Actually, when it came to ex-Muslims and the true intersection of them and how they would affect on your personal physical safety, the state did not know what to do. I'm sure, unfortunately, you probably didn't have any opportunity this morning or earlier on GB News to say any of that.
No, sadly not. So that's just one example. But I think if we could give one other example, a much more mainstream example, we know from our data, Tom, that we have helped 2,700 people with cases at the Free Speech Union over the last 4 years. And of those, I think I'm right in saying 45% have related in some way to people's working conditions. And within that figure, a lot of people come to us and say, I'm being investigated by my employer, or I've been disciplined by my employer, or I've been sacked by my employer for expressing my completely lawful, political, philosophical, gender critical, religious beliefs, whatever it might be. And so in a country, in a situation now where you only really have freedom of speech within the law, and of course that is becoming more confined, if you're independently wealthy and you don't have to rely on the goodwill of your employer, and you're not subject to one of those contracts that says that you must not bring your employer into disrepute. Oh, and by the way, we get to define what disrepute means. So in that situation, again, it seems completely reasonable that if people want to take part in political debate, they're going to want to do so anonymously. I'm afraid that that's just a completely natural response to a situation where your employment protections are scarce, to put it mildly.
Yeah. And I think the word knee-jerk comes in here, doesn't it? Because the two examples you've just given of the workplace and protecting the employees' legal rights, and then religious groups such as Exmuslims being protected in a situation where their life is at risk. In both of those situations, the anonymity is a lifeline.
Yeah.
And to sweep it away with a piece of legislation or a new guidance, even as we know, actually sometimes primary legislation isn't needed. You just need to give the police or whoever it is some guidance, and that's enough to sweep away any protections. So I fear we're going to see something of a great rotation. We've spoken about the rotation of free speech issues into the workplace and the private sector, out of the public sector. With these knee-jerk reactions that we're seeing, there is, I think, a risk of a rotation back into the state sector, and then they'll dance together. The private sector and the state and the public sector will do a dance of who can suppress free expression better and more effectively, and they'll work in a new symbiosis on that. Which brings us on to our next topic, I think, doesn't it, Ben? In terms of PSPOs.
Yeah. I'll yield the floor to you, Tom, because I've done my rant on the subject of online anonymity. So I think it's your turn.
It's my turn to cover this. So this is PSPOs we've talked about. PSPO stands for Public Spaces Protection Order. They were brought in quite a long time ago. The idea was brought in with a piece of legislation called the Antisocial Behaviour, Crime and Policing Act, and that was in 2014, and brought in for perfectly reasonable, there was perfectly reasonable justification for it, which was to help councils manage issues such as prostitution, such as begging, loitering, drinking alcohol, just to make the town centres that we see around the country, in difficult situations, just to make them better for everybody, by enabling councils to deal with social problems. But what we've seen, surprise, surprise, is a creep in the way that these PSPOs are being used. So the council can establish some parameters around a PSPO and can expect citizens to do things such as don't loiter within that PSPO that they've established. However, Section 72 of the same Act does require them to have particular regard to the rights of freedom of expression and freedom of assembly set out in Articles 10 and 11 of the European Convention of Human Rights. Our concern is we've done a huge amount of analysis on PSPOs, how they're being applied. Our concern is that there is not sufficient regard actually being paid to the citizens' rights under those two articles. And of the PSPOs we've assessed, when we talked about this before, it's about 16. As a rule, we've seen that it's honoured more in the breach than in reality. So the one we wanted to talk about was Thanet, because it was a particularly egregious PSPO. And why was it egregious? Well, it was egregious because it goes as far as you could face a criminal conviction for causing a disturbance to others or being pejorative in public, among other things. And so it effectively imposes a strict liability speech offence with none of the safeguards that I just went through that Parliament expected students to think about, and the courts expect the councils to think about. And the other thing is they're meant to be restricted in terms of geography. So they're not meant to cover your whole borough, your whole district. But this Thanet order, would apply to the entire built-up area around the Thanet coastline. And so we think it's irrational.
Yeah.
I don't think any reasonable public authority could have arrived at that decision. We think it exceeds the powers that the council has, and we think it's an impermissible interference with the right to freedom of speech. And so what we have done is we've written to the council with a letter before claim, and we are threatening to take it up to judicial review, which no council or any authority likes, because that means the judiciary is going to sit and determine how they have interpreted the law and set precedent, depending on how that determination and outcome comes. And of course, the council immediately loses control of the narrative at that point, and gets, it could, what they thought they could use PSPOs for suddenly goes out the window, because there's a judicial review and they establish new parameters for how these need to be thought through.
We'll be coming back to the point about judicial review in a different context in a moment, importantly.
We will. It's been such a fast-moving week, hasn't it?
But this Thanet PSPO, I mean, we've seen others as well, and we have people send requests to us asking us to look into what's going on in their area, which we've been doing some of that as well in recent weeks and months. But it brings up this possibility, doesn't it, of every council having its own, a patchwork of free speech restriction, where you don't know what the law is moving from one town to another. Extraordinary overreach by local government councillors and bureaucrats. And the point about being pejorative, I mean, as I understood it, Tom, if you and I were walking through Thanet and we were pejorative about a third party, and somebody else overheard us say that, that could bring us within scope of this PSPO. It's extraordinary.
Yeah. If the wrong person heard us at the wrong time and was aware of this PSPO, or was an enforcement officer from the council, then you're absolutely right. We could be caught, and the penalties here are quite significant. You can get fined, and going back to your point about that, the citizens aren't going to be aware of what they have as you go through this patchwork quilt, what's hanging over them in terms of PSPOs. You drive, it's a bit like turning into sort of going over the state line in the United States of America. You only need to go over the state line, and you're in a new sort of authority, a new jurisdiction. And suddenly you can talk in certain ways that you couldn't talk about 5 minutes ago when you stopped for petrol back in the other state. So it is mad. We exactly, patchwork quilt is exactly the right.
I was just thinking about this idea that I've seen. I think, I can't remember who, but on Twitter, that Britain and the British public go through these cycles of libertinism to Puritanism, and so you go from Cromwell to the Restoration, you go from the Regency to the Victorians to the Edwardians, and so on. And looking at this, there is absolutely no doubt that we are in a phase where the Puritans are firmly in control of every lever of power.
Yes. The word, it was actually in the previous segment when we were talking, the phrase that occurred to me, I first heard Frank Furedi saying it, is social amnesia. The generation who understood very clearly how freedom works and what freedom is, that generation, we've forgotten that. We've forgotten how to interpret or how to solve today's problems in a way that protects freedom of speech and the importance of it. We've forgotten how important it is to find a way and to find a balance. And so we get a lot of, police forces, councils sort of looking at us askance, tilting their head on their side and saying, what do you mean free speech? Don't you want to be nice?
Yes.
Don't you want to make our, and you kind of realize, we've got to go right the way back to first principles.
The default assumption for people doing this sort of thing is that exactly as you've just said, Tom, that freedom of speech it's just not even on their radar, that there is a question of balancing people's rights, upholding people's rights. It's just extraordinary. It's a bonkers story, isn't it?
It really is. But you mentioned judicial review, didn't you? And so judicial review has been the phrase of the week. It's a very serious business going for judicial review. As I say, it involves the judiciary. First of all, it has to be accepted by the court that they will indeed look into something. So it's not a given that everything will end up subject to judicial review. But it really does establish how things are to be interpreted. In this instance, we're back at the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act 2023 that I'm sure all of our listeners and our viewers are very familiar with. And we've written a pre-action protocol letter into Bridget Phillipson, who's our education secretary. She was the one, remember, who struck the Free Speech Freedom of Act commencement out, just struck it out just over a week ago, so that we will no longer have that piece of legislation being enacted, but it's still on the statute books, and that's the point. Because in our letter, one of the arguments we make is that this has gone through a parliamentary process, and it is not for the executive to strike out a piece of law that has gone through the full parliamentary process. We are a parliamentary democracy. Yeah. And so that's, I think, quite a first and very strong argument. Now, I don't think we're stupid in that if the government decided to go through a parliamentary process in order to repeal the act, well, then that would be due process. And they have enough of a majority that they probably could make that happen. But they haven't done that.
And we made this point last week that they deserve to have to go through the battle of saying, we are going to spend 6 months or more of parliamentary time repeal, or however long it takes, repealing something called the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act. And we don't believe there is a sufficient crisis of freedom of speech, academic freedom in universities to merit this piece of legislation. And they deserve to be scrutinised both in Parliament and in the press while they do that, because they are wrong. They are flat out wrong. Yeah. You said it's a very complicated business. It's also a very expensive business. So we have a legal fighting fund. We are raising money right now. We'll include a link beneath this week's episode if you would like to donate. We do a huge amount of good with some pretty small donations. They really do stack up. If you can bung in 10, 15 pounds, it really will help. Both of the other,
it all adds up.
And that's the case both when we're helping an individual member. We're going to talk about a couple of people that we've been helping, but also in this, when we're fighting this really important legal battle for this strategic issue to try and save the Freedom of Speech Act. Really important stuff.
And the second argument is that if the executive is going to strike out something that's gone through the parliamentary process, a piece of statute, what have they done in terms of thinking about the consequences of that? What have they done in terms of thinking about what does that mean for gender critical feminists in academia, who are, as you say, the sorts of people we're going to come on and talk about in a minute.
Yeah.
But yeah, at any time that the law is changed or the government does something new, you have to think about the consequences. But just striking it out in the way that it did, well, what happened? I mean, maybe there was a sort of behind the scenes process that we don't know about, but we've asked to see that in the letter.
It's fair to say the first month of the new government's approach to freedom of speech issues is not filling us with confidence. Let's put it that way. But we do have some good news to share, and this is the case of Dr. Laura Favaro. Who was, she's had a victory that was reported last week, which is excellent news. Her story, I feel like I should be rationed in describing something as bonkers or extraordinary or whatever, or using any kind of hyperbolic term.
Or sections.
But there's so much where you just think, oh my God, how on earth has that happened? How has this situation been allowed to develop? But in Laura's case, I'm going to have to use one of my ration of the word extraordinary again. She was doing research looking at the silencing or the experiences of people who'd expressed gender critical views, people who, and actually the other side of the debate as well, and the experiences of people who are engaged in that debate. So she was not part of that debate at that time. She was merely exploring the contours of this conversation and what the sort of penalties were that people were suffering for speaking out on these issues. And in response, she got to the point where her employer, City University London, there was such an acrimonious situation about this after she started writing about her research that they denied her access to her own research. And she's had to go through an employment trial, or go through the process of the employment tribunal and so on. It's now settled. But Tom, I mean, it's just bonkers. I spoke to Laura right at the start of this case, and delighted, absolutely delighted for her that she's now won. But it's just extraordinary. And what
she's settled.
Yeah. Now she's settled. And you know, I hope. And there was an article in the Telegraph about this, about crowdfunding for gender critical feminists. I hope that universities, even without the Higher Education Act, and likewise employers generally, will finally start to get the idea that gender critical beliefs are protected. It's crazy. All these years on after Forstater, and still we have a regular, inflow of cases like this.
What struck me about that is that the indignation of Laura's case, that she was actually cut off from her own research data, as well as sort of getting the normal ostracization or ostracizing that happens in these workplaces.
Being forced out.
If you're brave enough to stick your paw in the air and saying, even I am not even take a view, just say I am concerned that we're not balanced here, is enough. Not only to get ostracized, but to get frozen out from your own research on that topic. What I was really struck by is the £95,000 that was collected on crowd justice. It's a heck of a lot of money. I mean, normally first targets are £5,000, £10,000, £15,000, but to have something that high, had to have been crowdfunded. I think really crowdfunding, legal crowdfunding, has come of age, and it's as we've already said, it's an extremely effective way of helping people. And there's enough of a surge of feeling, should we put it like that, in the country now that women's rights have been suppressed, and that we're in 2024. I know that's a meaningless thing because it's just an arbitrary year, but that given all that's come before culturally, that we should now be suppressing women's rights in the way that we are. We see this money rolling in, and it's going to be redeployed to support similar cases. So it's not going to be, none of it will be wasted. But when we talk about setting precedent, then the next case is also quite an important one, isn't it, Ben? And one that you've been involved on, that of Almet Gadot.
Yes, this is a crowdfunder that's still ongoing, and Almet has raised £79,000 so far. We think this is a very important case, both to help Almet, but also in order to defend academic freedom generally. So to give some of the background to this, so Dr. Almet Gadot worked for the Open University. She had questioned one of these equality, diversity, and inclusion diktats that have been percolating throughout the university sector now for the best part of the last decade. This one saying that criminal law tutors must liberate the curriculum by introducing diverse gender identities, by instructing law students to use the preferred pronouns of offenders. Now, clearly, that's a situation, as we've seen with what's been going on in Scotland and women's prisons, that creates the most perverse possible situations in courtrooms where you're dealing with sexually violent offenders. The idea that male rapists, it's a tautology, it's redundant to say that rapists should have any ability or latitude to be treated in the legal system as women is so utterly perverse. Anyway, clearly that's the outcome of this sort of teaching. And she questioned this over a fairly extended period of time, was pushing back against these sorts of diktats. It's yet another case where somebody has either been forced out or sacked or frozen out or left unable to feel working at a university for pushing back against this sort of stuff that we see in universities and every sector of society. Now, what's important about this, as I said, is the principle of defending academic freedom, which is at the heart of her story. And of course, now that the Freedom of Speech Act has been sabotaged by the government and may well not be implemented now, hopefully our judicial review will succeed. Perhaps even then, as we've said, it will be repealed. But nonetheless, defending Almut's case and upholding academic freedom within the law that we have at the moment is obviously something that's now become even more important, given the events of the last 2 weeks and the actions of the Education Secretary, than it was when we started the case. So a really important one.
We have to set new precedents. If we don't have the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act, then we have to win these kinds of cases to establish protection of academic freedom. I mean, the idea of a university coming in and insisting that a course be rewritten in line with a dogma, a religion, a cult, is just mind-blowing. But that is the woke mind virus. That is everything we speak about every single week. I think that's all that we have for this week. Ben, is there anything else you wanted to add?
No, I don't think so. We've got through quite a lot, and I think we've said every week of the new government, Tom, God only knows what is going to happen before we speak to you again. And I think actually we're not going to have an episode, are we, for a fortnight now, because I will be away.
That's right. We're going to take a week off because we're in August and nothing ever happens in August.
Right, yeah. So we'll see.
We'll need a double bill when we come back.
We'll see what things look like in 2 weeks' time. So I think that's all probably, isn't it? I think goodbye.
I think that's all from us. So goodbye from us.